We find ourselves in the quiet hum of a predictable morning. The light streams through the window just as it has streamed for countless mornings before. There is a rhythm to this routine, a comfortable predictability that once felt like safety. But today, something subtle shifts in the air. It is not dramatic or alarming. It is simply a weight of realization. We are doing things exactly as always. The cup of coffee tastes familiar. The path to work has worn down predictable footsteps into the pavement, and the checklist items remain unchanged. This predictability, we realize with a sudden jolt of clarity, feels less like comfort and more like stagnation. We have settled into a groove that is functional, yes, but emotionally muted. It is meaningless in the deepest sense. The sheer weight of routine begins to press upon the spirit. Sometimes, we mistake mere habit for contentment. We accept motion simply because it requires effort, mistaking action for progress. The mind, ever adept at self-soothing through repetition, naturally resists change. Resistance often appears soft, woven into the very fabric of our daily choices. It manifests in a slight delay before answering an email or a subconscious reach for the phone even when there is nothing to see on it. We are performing acts that do not feed the soul. They only maintain the schedule. Standing still, in fact, doesn't feel like rest sometimes. It feels like going backward, like sinking gently into sediment. There is an inertia pulling us back toward what is known, even if what is known is fundamentally depleting. This deep-seated dissatisfaction, this quiet ache in the corner of the heart, is often mistaken for a problem outside ourselves. We look at circumstances, at people, or at external pressures, and assume that they are the source of our discomfort. Yet, upon closer inspection, the true landscape of discontent is internal. It resides within the scripted narratives we run repeatedly through our minds. These scripts are seductive. They warn us about potential danger, or they replay minor failures to ensure we do not make them again. But they have become habits of worry, comfortable yet deeply self-sabotaging mechanisms that keep us precisely where we started. We find ourselves confronted by the sheer power of our own inner architecture. Every ingrained habit, every reflexive thought pattern, the immediate checking of a device for trivial updates, the tendency to preemptively worry about tomorrow's potential misstep. These are not external pressures forcing our hand. They are internal agreements, comfortable but restrictive scripts running on an endless loop. We treat these mental patterns like immutable laws of physics, unable to deviate from their established path. The struggle, therefore, is not against the world. It is against the polished ease of our own predictable minds. The morning becomes a space for brutal self-inventory. We stare out at the unchanging view, and in that emptiness, we are forced to acknowledge the depth of our complacency. To simply exist within this pattern feels like an exercise in slow regression. The profound recognition dawns. True growth requires not merely effort, but a fundamental shift in perspective, a reframing of what constitutes genuine movement. This realization is unsettling because it demands that we reject the very safety net of the known. It suggests that inertia, while easy, is ultimately the greatest impediment to the life we are truly meant to live. The challenge before us, then, is daunting. It asks us to dismantle the architecture of our comfort zones, to recognize that the illusion of stability provided by routine is, in fact, a gilded cage. The plateau is not merely a pause. It is a moment where the expected upward momentum abruptly ceases, forcing an uncomfortable confrontation with the self. And this confrontation, though painful, holds the seeds for everything that follows. The chance to choose a different path, right here, right now, before one more day passes, by indistinguishable from the last. If we examine the quiet moments of our lives, what do we truly find? We often believe that the biggest barriers to change exist outside us, that a new job, a perfect person, or some miraculous event must happen before we can finally begin. But as we learn, the most persistent resistance comes from within. It is not an external enemy we face. It is the echo of our own habits, whispering doubts into the quiet spaces of our minds. These whispers are subtle at first glance. They manifest as a reflexive check of the phone when we wait in line, an instant jump to worry about an outcome that hasn't even occurred yet. They arrive disguised as caution or maybe even as comfort. We think these thoughts keep us safe, keeping us predictable and thus, paradoxically, keeping us small. The whispers of resistance are simply the scripts we have run countless times before. Our minds love efficiency, and what is most efficient for a mind is to repeat what it already knows. These old thought patterns, the constant self-criticism, the habit of comparison, the impulse to avoid any form of deep stillness, they are merely ingrained survival mechanisms that no longer serve us. To confront them requires more than simple awareness. It demands an intellectual honesty bordering on discomfort. We must meet these thoughts not as absolute facts about who we are, but as fleeting visitors passing through the hall of our consciousness. They are data points, nothing more. The anxious belief that something terrible might happen tomorrow is a thought, and therefore, by definition, it has no intrinsic weight or guaranteed reality. It feels natural to argue with these whispers, to try to rationally debunk them, but resistance rarely yields to logic alone. It requires acceptance first. We must learn the stoic art of acknowledgement, to say, I observe that I am worrying about tomorrow. This simple framing shifts us from being the anxiety to simply observing the anxiety. The moment we create distance between ourselves and our habitual thoughts, we find a small, liberating gap. This space is where genuine change takes root. It is in the breath taken just before the knee-jerk reaction. It is in the pause after the initial spike of frustration. This pausing is not passive. It is an active choice to suspend judgment and emotion. It is a disciplined rebellion against automaticity. Consider the habit of scrolling through feeds, absorbing curated lives that promise perfection. That impulse is fueled by comparison, a form of resistance arguing we are somehow lacking. But when we pause and simply acknowledge the need for connection or validation without performing it, we strip away its power. We realize the source of our discomfort is often not external scarcity, but internal expectation. The whispers also tell us stories about who we should be, the perfect partner, the successful colleague, the mindful individual. These should statements are perhaps the most insidious forms of resistance because they feel like moral obligations. They bind us to an imagined standard that life rarely meets. True freedom begins when we dismantle these rigid expectations and accept that human experience is inherently messy, unpredictable, and therefore infinitely richer. This internal work can be exhausting. To continually confront the self-generated narrative requires monumental energy. There will be days when the old scripts feel deeply comforting, like a heavy familiar blanket on a cold night. The brain prefers the known pattern, even if that pattern is painful or limiting. Yet, we learn to treat this internal resistance not as a failure, but as evidence of growth itself. Each time we successfully intercept an anxious thought, each time we resist the urge to complain or react instantly, we are strengthening a different kind of muscle, the muscle of conscious choice. We are proving that our inner life belongs to us, and that we hold the ultimate authority over what we choose to focus upon. The journey through these whispers teaches us profound self-mastery. It shows us that strength is not found in how fiercely we fight against external pressures, but in the quiet resilience of acknowledging what already exists within us. The comfortable habits, the ingrained fears, the habitual judgments, and choosing a different response, one deep breath at a time. This realization brings a form of profound accountability. We are responsible for the space between stimulus and response. That small interval, lasting only moments, is where our entire future choice resides. And in that fraction of a second lies all the power to rewrite the script and finally begin living not according to expectation, but according to conscious truth. We found ourselves finally at the bench. It was an ordinary bench, perhaps in a quiet corner of a park or overlooking a slow-moving river. Nothing dramatic about it, yet everything about us felt suspended by its simple presence. For weeks, we had been navigating the turbulent currents of our own mind, battling self-sabotaging scripts and learning the crucial art of the pause. We understood that freedom was not found in changing external circumstances, but in choosing our response to them. But knowledge, even profound wisdom, often feels abstract when it is merely an idea floating in the air. What do we do with it? How does understanding become lived reality? It felt like the question that sat heavily between us and this weathered wood beneath us. The quiet was immense. Not a silence empty of sound, but a deep fullness, weighted by possibility. And then it came. It did not arrive as a booming revelation, nor as an external lecture delivered from authority. Instead, it settled into the air like fine dust, a simple question, whispered just enough to catch our attention, yet broad enough to encompass every fear and ambition we held. The question was deceptively simple. What is truly yours to change? It was a sudden and humbling redirection. We had spent so much time focusing on what we could control, the habits, the reactions, the thoughts. But this profound query demanded a deeper excavation of our locus of control itself. Was it simply the choice of response, or did the boundaries of that control extend further? Did accepting life's unpredictability mean giving up the map entirely? We spent time considering this question from every angle. We mapped out the external forces, the economy, the actions of others, the inevitability of decay and change itself. These things felt massive, unyielding, outside the delicate confines of our personal will. And yet, staring into that vast ocean of the uncontrollable, a subtle guiding force began to assert itself. The shift was not in trying harder to control the external world, but in understanding where the absolute boundaries lay. The philosophy spoke quietly then, echoing ancient wisdom from stoic halls and contemplative groves. It gently guided our focus back inward, narrowing the scope until we arrived at a point of exquisite personal clarity. This realization began with acknowledging what was not ours to change. The weather tomorrow, the opinion of others about us, or the actions taken by people who cared for us but whose free will belonged solely to them. To expend emotional energy fighting those currents is to exhaust oneself entirely without altering the current's course. The challenge that unfolded before us was one of necessary acceptance, not a passive resignation, but an active embrace of reality as it presents itself. Acceptance meant discarding the deep-seated need to mandate how life ought to be. It was the painful letting go of should statements concerning the external world. We realized that many of our greatest anxieties stem from mistaking our preferences for universal laws. To believe that others should react a certain way, or that circumstances must conform to our comfort zone, is a blueprint for perpetual frustration. The practice developed from simply identifying what was uncontrollable. It became an intense mental sorting process. We started to draw precise lines in the sand of our understanding. Here lies my responsibility. Here lies everything else. The freedom derived from this intellectual honesty was startling and powerful. When we stopped assigning ownership over outcomes that belonged to chance or to another person's choice, a massive amount of psychic energy flooded back into us. This reclaimed energy did not dissipate. It found its way to the single most impactful place, our own internal judgment and immediate response. The deepest lesson was this: the only thing truly mine, the one commodity I possess complete ownership over, is my assessment of reality and, consequently, the choice of how I reply. Everything else arrives on me like a relentless tide. It is indifferent to my liking or disliking. It simply is. And yet, by choosing where we place our efforts, we reclaim our internal sovereignty. This was not about giving up hope. Rather, it was about grounding that hope in something unshakable. We were taught that true resilience does not come from insulating ourselves against suffering or disappointment. Instead, it is forged by recognizing the unavoidable friction between what we desire and what reality delivers. The wisest people of old did not promise lives free of struggle. They promised a perspective through which one could face the inevitable chaos with dignity and calm integrity. This understanding became a foundational pillar in our journey. It gave us permission to stop fighting battles that were not ours to fight. We learned to observe external events, a criticism, a missed opportunity, a delay, with detached curiosity. Was this truly my problem? Or was it an unfortunate confluence of variables outside the scope of my immediate influence? The difference between those two questions held the key to peace. By narrowing our focus solely onto the response available in this present moment, we shed the crushing weight of imagined futures and past regrets. The ancient bench thus became not a place of rest, but an altar for profound realignment. It forced us into confrontation with the architecture of self-limitation, the subtle but unbreakable chains that kept our desires shackled to the approval or behavior of others. The philosophy was nothing if not practical. It demanded rigorous mental discipline. It asked us daily, is this concern mine? Can I actually affect this outcome right now with my will alone? The commitment solidified a permanent shift in how we viewed agency. Agency is not omnipotence. It is the localized power of decision within one's own spirit. By realizing that our peace depends only on the quality of our internal response to an indifferent universe, we found an anchor point that could withstand any storm. The understanding solidified into a durable mental habit. When confronted by external chaos, we no longer scramble for blame or control mechanisms outside ourselves. We take a breath, and in that brief space, between stimulus and acceptance, we choose our virtuous response. This realization was the completion of a cycle, the intellectual journey giving way to an embodied state of profound internal freedom. It was finally understood. Life is unpredictable, but your core sense of self does not have to be. You became anchored by what you could own entirely, starting right here on this bench, with nothing more than the truth illuminated before you. We have spent weeks examining the edges of our own minds. We learned that much of what causes us pain is not the event itself, but the story we tell ourselves about the event. We understood that true resistance does not come from the world outside, but from the deeply comfortable whispers within. These were the initial shifts, recognizing the self-sabotaging scripts, cultivating the discipline of the pause, and accepting the profound truth that our only domain of power is our internal judgment. This understanding granted a deep, unsettling lightness. It felt like shedding a heavy coat we did not even realize we wore. But true transformation demands more than intellectual acknowledgement. It requires an inventory, a precise accounting of what truly anchors us to discontent. Imagine the mind as a vast marketplace. Every desire, every longing, every urgent emotional reaction has its stall. They scream for attention, more recognition, faster success, clearer certainty, or perhaps just the sweet oblivion found in endless distraction. In Chapter 4, we began the work of inventorying these desires. This was not an act of self-censure, but one of profound anthropological curiosity, an effort to understand the mechanism by which our attachments construct our perceived reality. The exercise itself was strangely simple, yet monumentally difficult. We were asked merely to list what causes distress. When you write down a pattern of upset emotions, the urgency often drains out of it. They lose their dramatic momentum upon the page. Perhaps it was the desperate need for affirmation from a colleague, that little ache in your chest when praised publicly but ignored privately. Or maybe it was the compulsive scroll through feeds, a never-ending chase after some external definition of completeness. Each item was cataloged with brutal honesty. I desire to be seen as competent. I require validation that my effort matters. I cannot tolerate ambiguity. The initial tendency is self-pity or defensiveness. We try to argue the list into submission. We rationalize why these desires are necessary, arguing that a person simply needs ambition, or perhaps a human craves connection. But philosophy teaches us to look past need and examine pure, raw attachment. What emotion does this desire point to? Often, it points to fear. Fear of being insufficient, fear of being alone, fear of the inevitable uncertainty of life itself. This process necessitated separating fundamental needs from mere wants. A need for connection is vital. That is a nutrient for the soul. But the want for constant connection, or the desperate craving for a particular type of acknowledgement, that was the emotional overinvestment, the anchor to suffering. We learned that many of our deepest sorrows are not born from genuine deprivation, but from the discrepancy between an idealized vision of how life should be and the messy reality of what it is. They call these desires mental gravity. They pull us back toward familiar patterns of emotional seeking. When you identify a desire, you must then ask two piercing questions. First, is this something within my direct sphere of influence? Second, if I relinquish the need for this specific outcome, what remains? The hardest realization of all was confronting the demand for external validation. We are creatures built to seek belonging, and that instinct is sacred. But when we treat the approval of others as a prerequisite for our own internal peace, we grant them undue spiritual authority over us. Realizing this meant slowly withdrawing permission from the crowd to define your worth. It felt like a withdrawal symptom, a sudden, acute nervousness in the absence of immediate praise or reassurance. Or course, inventorying desires is not a single task. It is a continuous commitment to critical self-examination. Life will present new flares of emotion, new habits disguised as necessities. When the urge returns, the familiar anxious rumination at 2 a.m., the need to check your phone for that meaningless burst of news, you must pause and ask, what desire am I attempting to satisfy right now? Is this craving solving an inner problem, or is it merely a temporary distraction from one we haven't yet acknowledged? This disciplined observation transforms the self into a student. Instead of being swept away by currents of emotional urgency, you become the calm observer on the bank. You see the desire arrive. You name it. There is the craving for certainty. There is the need to prove myself right. And then, crucially, you allow it to pass, without judgment and without engagement. This gentle dismissal of excessive craving builds a profound resilience, a quiet confidence that no external event can shake because its foundation rests only on what is within your own sovereignty. By separating needs from wants, We do not live in emotional deprivation. Rather, we achieve something far more robust: self-possession. We learn to appreciate the simple sufficiency of the present moment, recognizing that happiness is less a reward to be earned by achieving an external goal, and more a natural state achieved by ceasing to struggle against the reality of what simply is. This gentle but rigorous work on the inventory becomes the bedrock for all future changes, preparing the mind not merely for action, but for profound stillness. In the quiet moments between thoughts, a new space began to reveal itself. This was not an escape from life, but rather a direct confrontation with it. We had learned that true freedom did not come from changing our circumstances, for those things remained stubbornly outside of us. Instead, that profound liberty resided in the unscripted gap, the breath taken just before the response arrived. The pause became more than a technique. It transformed into an inner sanctuary, a space where reactivity simply could not exist. Consider the minor irritations we face daily: the slow movement of traffic, the dismissive tone of a colleague's email, or the unexpected cancellation that disrupts our carefully laid plans. In the past, these moments were immediate triggers, demanding instant emotional expenditure: a snapping retort, a flurry of defensive thoughts, an uncontrolled surge of impatience. The old self simply reacted. It was automatic, fueled by habit and expectation. But in this space we cultivated, something shifted. We learned to resist the impulse to fill that silence. We began to treat those moments not as problems to be solved instantly, but as opportunities for deliberate stillness. To pause is to create a sacred gap between what happens to us and how we choose to respond to it. It is an active practice of self-command, requiring more mental discipline than any grand philosophical treatise could teach. This realization carried enormous weight. The old scripts demanded speed. They demanded immediate justice or emotional retaliation. To pause felt counterintuitive, even sluggish. We were accustomed to the dopamine rush of reacting, the quick defensive post, the sharp rebuttal that temporarily feels satisfying. Yet, we began to understand that this quick expenditure was often more costly than the temporary discomfort of waiting. The cost was always paid later, in regret, resentment, or simply the weariness of being perpetually reactive. The power of the pause is therefore an act of withholding. It means giving ourselves permission, moment by moment, to breathe and observe before we engage. When faced with a challenge, the instinct might be to defend, to justify, or to retreat entirely. The pause allows us instead to perform an internal inventory. What am I feeling right now? Is this irritation rooted in the slow car outside, or is it rooted in my own belief that life must unfold according to my perfect schedule? This delicate questioning unravels the drama. We realize how much of our discomfort stems not from external events themselves, but from the rigid demands we place upon those external events. This mindful hesitation began to change our relationships profoundly. In conversations where we once rushed to dominate or interrupt, we learned the profound discipline of listening into the silence. We were no longer formulating our rebuttal while the other person was still speaking. Instead, we trained ourselves to absorb the words fully, letting their meaning settle without the immediate need to correct them or build upon them. This deep attention, this commitment to merely hearing, was one of the most liberating practices. It required us to temporarily put aside our own urgent narrative and accept the richness, sometimes messy and unpolished, of another person's experience. Consider the ripple effect this ability has on stress management. Before, a challenging email would instantly escalate into personal slight. An unexpected request felt like a major blow to our carefully constructed boundaries. The pause forced us to decelerate our internal processing. We learned that slowing down does not mean inaction. It means intentional action. It means gathering the scattered fragments of emotion and arranging them calmly before they are presented in the world. It is a disciplined way of claiming our sovereignty over our inner state. Furthermore, we began to notice how often should statements masqueraded as urgent emotions. When we pause before criticizing a behavior or judging an outcome, we inevitably confront the underlying expectation. The impulse shifts from blaming the other person for not meeting an invisible standard to examining ourselves. Why is that expectation so fixed? What am I afraid will happen if reality deviates from my perfect model? By pausing, we strip away the layers of judgment and reveal the fragile core fear beneath it all. This practice, this disciplined withdrawal into self-awareness, is not merely a coping mechanism. It is the foundation for profound mental independence. By mastering the breath taken between stimulus and response, we are effectively building a reliable buffer zone around our sense of self. The external world can be chaotic, people can disappoint, circumstances can shift with brutal unpredictability, but within that private space, protected by the conscious choice to pause, there is constancy. There is the recognition that no matter what impinges upon us from without, we always retain the ultimate authority over the gate through which those events pass into our experience. It is this internal fortress that gives rise not just to resilience, but to a quiet, unshakable self-possession, the true measure of freedom. We have traveled through the necessary stages of self-discovery. We learned to anchor ourselves in what we could control, accepting that the external world remains fundamentally unpredictable. We found power in the deliberate pause, creating a sacred space between stimulus and reaction. These lessons provided structure, a way to respond when life demanded it. But true growth requires more than just strategy. It demands radical self-honesty. It means facing those shadows we prefer to keep comfortably shrouded. This chapter asks us to look at the patterns that repeat themselves, not because they are logical mistakes, but because they feel familiar, like an old coat you never quite discard. We must confront the deep undercurrents of resistance, the self-blame narratives, the ingrained tendencies toward procrastination, the times we sabotage our own momentum out of a misguided sense of safety or even habit. These patterns often settle in subtle traps, whispers that convince us this pattern is who we are. To confront them head-on feels like an internal conflict worthy of epic struggle. We expect resistance to come from external forces, a demanding boss, difficult family expectations. But the most stubborn and enduring opponent has always resided within our own judgment. It was easy enough to observe the anxiety or the craving for validation. Those feelings feel transient, something we simply outlogic. But the core behavioral patterns are deeper. They are weighted with shame and habit. When we finally agree to examine self-blame, it does not arrive as a single moment of realization. It surfaces as a complex tapestry of perceived failure. We build intricate mental defenses around this narrative. If I fail now, it proves I was flawed all along. This is the emotional armor that keeps us from deep commitment. Recognizing these patterns requires immense empathy for oneself, a compassion often withheld even in moments of struggle. The work shifts from simply noticing a bad reaction to observing the entire mechanism of self-sabotage. We learn to see procrastination not as laziness, but as a deeply complex response to potential overwhelm or fear. The sheer scale of necessary change seems too large, so the mind finds the easier, safer path, doing nothing at all. How do you observe shame? Shame is fundamentally an emotional attachment to your identity. It whispers that if others see your true self, the unpolished, flawed, striving self, they will reject you. This fear of judgment, this internalizing of criticism, fuels the cycles of giving up right before success seems possible. The practice here becomes one of radical intellectual acceptance. Instead of fighting the impulse to blame or delay, we learn to turn toward it with curiosity. Imagine treating that old habit, that deeply ingrained narrative of inadequacy, not as an enemy to be vanquished, but as a chronic companion, an old friend who needs simply acknowledging presence. We observe its contours. When does the blame arrive? What physical sensation accompanies the impulse to delay? What belief about ourselves is it attempting to protect? This observing process must be stripped of judgment itself. If we judge the pattern, say, thinking, "I should never fall back into procrastination again," we only create another layer of resistance, creating a fight against the fighting. Instead, the language shifts to pure description. I notice that when faced with this difficult task, my mind automatically creates an elaborate mental list of reasons why it is impossible right now. That is all there is. The objective here is not perfection. It is acknowledging reality in its full, messy spectrum, including the times we fall short spectacularly. We are learning to live simultaneously in a state of deep yearning for better and genuine acceptance of current imperfection. This synthesis is where real power lies. It means recognizing that the cycle of attempting change, failing, feeling bad about the failure, and then giving up is itself a predictable pattern. The greatest breakthrough comes when we stop trying to achieve an instant, pristine state of being. Instead, we commit to the messy process of re-showing up. We accept that growth is inherently asymmetrical. There will be periods where effort feels pointless, where discipline wavers under the weight of perceived impossibility. The core teaching from this hard truth is radical self-forgiveness, combined with unwavering responsibility. It is acknowledging the pattern without allowing the pattern to define your worth or limit your next action. The story we tell ourselves about our flaws must be updated daily. I am not defined by my failures. I am defined by the quality of my return to effort after those failures. This willingness to look at the most inconvenient parts of oneself, the predictable stumbling blocks, is perhaps the hardest mountain we climb on the path. But by simply naming these hidden mechanisms, the whispers of self-blame, the comfort of delay, we strip them of their mysterious power and render them merely observable data points. And understanding those points is the first step toward permanent freedom. We have journeyed through moments of deep realization. We learn to confront the whisper of resistance, recognizing that our deepest obstacles are not found outside us, but woven into the comfortable scripts we play day after day. We discovered that true freedom is an internal act of will, the ability to choose our response in the space between stimulus and action. From ancient wisdom, we began accepting what was beyond our command, focusing instead on the sovereign territory of our own judgment. The inventory of desires taught us the necessary art of dismissal, separating genuine need from temporary emotional craving. And through moments like the power of the pause, we built a subtle yet unbreakable muscle, the space to breathe before reacting. We learned that growth does not demand perfect struggle, but rather honest acknowledgement, that failure is simply data, and self-blame only thrives when it is observed, not accepted as truth. The journey has required us to be painfully honest with ourselves, treating our flaws not as enemies to be defeated, but as complex companions demanding gentle observation. Now we arrive at a stillness deeper than any quiet moment. This is the discipline of observation itself. Observation, in its purest sense, requires nothing and accepts everything. It is the act of sitting back from the drama of your own mind and viewing it as if you were watching life through an unbiased pane of glass. The most challenging thing about observation is that we are experts at judging what we see. We automatically label a thought as bad or a feeling as wrong, assigning moral weight to our internal landscape. But the observer understands that labels are constructions, not facts. Thought is simply electricity moving through a system. It has no inherent goodness or badness until you choose to assign one. To practice this discipline means treating every passing mental event, a sudden rush of anxiety over tomorrow, an old resentment flaring up in response to minor slights, the nagging voice whispering what we should have done differently yesterday, as merely a transient occurrence. You are not your thoughts. They are like clouds passing across a vast sky. The sky remains unchanged, regardless of how many storms pass through it. The initial days of this practice are bewildering. It feels effortless at first, almost too easy. But soon the mind rebels. It craves reaction. When you sit with nothing but pure observation, the mind attempts to fill the void with narrative. It tries to build drama, conflict, or solution where none is required. You will find yourself analyzing the act of observing itself. You might think, am I doing this right? Am I observing deeply enough? Should I be feeling enlightened by now? These questions are merely evidence of your engagement with the practice, not a measure of its success. The key shifts from judgment to curiosity. Instead of asking, why am I thinking this? You must ask, what is this thought like? Observe it for texture. Is it sharp and jagged? Is it soft and wispy? Is it loud or does it whisper? Does it carry a sense of urgency or is it meandering and slow? By removing the internal critique, the constant narrative layer that says, this is bad because I am feeling this, you create critical distance. You move from identification to cataloging. The deepest work here is dismantling the belief in thought as fact. When a memory surfaces, accompanied by a wave of sadness or frustration, your natural inclination is to be swept away by that emotion and believe it completely. Observation demands you pause at the edge of that feeling and ask, is this feeling an indicator of reality, or merely my emotional reaction to a stored interpretation of reality? You learn that the pain resides not in the event itself, but in the story you tell yourself about the event. This becomes a meticulous internal audit. You start noticing patterns with crystalline clarity. Perhaps every time you feel ignored by someone important, your mind constructs an elaborate narrative of abandonment, leading to a spiral of self-doubt. Before, you would have been swept into that vortex, defending against the perceived injury or spiraling into self-pity. Now you observe it. Ah, there is the script running again, the story of abandonment. I acknowledge its presence and return my focus to the breath. By naming the pattern without judgment, you weaken its power dramatically. You are not fixing the underlying pain. You are simply becoming unimpressed by the mechanism that generates the pain. This discipline does not promise immediate peace. Some days, the flow of mental noise will be a roaring river, overwhelming and chaotic. On those days, the success is not found in achieving silence, but in maintaining presence amid the noise. It is the commitment to showing up for your own consciousness, breath after conscious breath, the accumulated power of this sustained observation, the refusal to automatically react to every internal tremor or external nudge, is profound. It builds a mental fortress around the core self. It teaches you that while emotions are powerful, they are temporary guests in a vast and enduring house. You remain the steady walls, the structure that holds everything else at bay. The quiet habit of observation leads inevitably to radical acceptance. Not merely accepting what is, but accepting the entirety of what has been, what is being, and what might be. It teaches you that resistance is the greatest expenditure of energy. To resist a current emotion or to fight a recurring thought pattern requires tremendous mental struggle. But simply noting it, there is anxiety present, allows the tension to diffuse, recognizing that existence, in its truest form, is indifferent to our desire for control. This mastery of observation becomes your ultimate anchor. It allows you to enter into the messy reality of life and find not a sudden answer, but an undeniable stability within. You realize that self-mastery is not about achieving perfect thoughts or flawless behavior. It is simply about reliably returning to the point of noticing. To be present enough to notice the moment before judgment falls, and choosing stillness instead. The journey to change is often seen as a grand upheaval, a single massive event that radically remakes everything in its path. But the wisdom we collect along the way suggests something far more subtle, far more demanding. Change begins with the very smallest gesture. We have spent weeks understanding the machinery of our minds. We learn to observe the anxious whispers, recognizing them not as absolute truths, but as passing thought formations. We found power in pausing, creating that sacred space between what is felt and what we choose to do. We mapped out the inventory of things we merely wanted, distinguishing them from the genuine core needs of our being. The previous lessons prepared us for radical self-acceptance, the gentle acknowledgement of flaws like procrastination or ingrained self-blame. But observation alone can sometimes feel academic, a detached exercise in philosophy. It requires wisdom, but it does not always create motion. Movement demands risk, and risk, ultimately, is the prerequisite for courage. Not the heroic kind depicted in epic poems, with swords raised against overwhelming odds. No, this is something far more intimate, quieter, and far harder. The small act of personal defiance against our own gravitational pull back towards comfort. Courage, we have learned through the Stoics, is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act in spite of it. It is the intellectual agreement that discomfort is a better teacher than complacency. We must stop waiting for the perfect moment or the overwhelming motivation, because those are illusions. Growth does not wait for permission. The challenge now is concrete and immediate. It means identifying something, a small, contained action, that feels genuinely out of character, out of habit, or deeply uncomfortable. Perhaps it is raising a voice in a meeting when instinct urges silence. Perhaps it is taking a detour on your familiar route home, choosing the road that seems most arduous. The initial encounter with this discomfort is always accompanied by the weight of expectation. We anticipate failure, rejection, or awkwardness. The internal critic, having been so well fed by our previous observations, screams warnings. You do not know enough. You will sound foolish. They will not understand. These whispers are powerful because they masquerade as protection. But we now carry a different shield. It is the accumulated knowledge of the pause. When that intense fear washes over us, that hot wave of what-ifs, we do not react. We breathe into the space created by pausing, remembering that this moment of panic is merely data. It is information about our own limitations, and understanding it lessens its power. The small act requires us to temporarily suspend our carefully constructed emotional armor. To speak up when agreement is safer, or to admit a gap in knowledge when defensiveness feels necessary, demands an exquisite form of self-vulnerability. This vulnerability is the engine of genuine change. The path forward is not linear. There will be days when the habit wins, days when we retreat into comfortable silence or predictable routines. And that is acceptable. The lesson lies not in never falling, but in the swiftness and tenderness with which we observe the fall, rise, and attempt again. The true measure of self-mastery is therefore not found in grand gestures, but in the persistent willingness to take one slightly terrifying step when all evidence suggests remaining still is easiest. It means committing to being present, fully engaged, even if that engagement leads nowhere beautiful or predictable. It means choosing to experience life in its raw, inconvenient unfolding. This small act of courage transforms our relationship with effort itself. Effort ceases to be a punishment for failure and becomes the intrinsic reward. The moment we choose difficulty over ease, regardless of the outcome, we reclaim sovereignty. We prove that the self we wish to be is stronger than the comforts we have known. It is in that uncomfortable doing, that tiny venture into the unknown space of our own lives, that true freedom begins. We have journeyed through the crucible of self-knowledge. We faced the whisperings of our own resistance in early chapters, learning that the greatest enemy resides not outside us, but within the comfortable narratives we tell ourselves. We discovered the profound freedom found only by mastering the space between stimulus and reaction. Our practice led us to define what truly belongs solely within our control, our judgment, our response, and the unwavering discipline of observation. Now, we reach a place where these lessons must culminate in something unavoidable, minor setbacks. We expect a grand moment of transformation, a sudden epiphany that clears the path forward entirely. But life, in its graceful complexity, rarely delivers such sweeping gestures. It teaches us instead through small friction points, moments of disappointment, and unexpected stumbles. These are the necessary lessons of Chapter 9, Redefining Failure. The old definition we held was rigid and punitive. Failure was seen as evidence of deficiency, a verdict on our inherent worth or skill set. When something went wrong, the inner critic roared, labeling the setback proof that we were fundamentally flawed, incapable of sustaining change. It felt like a regression to the plateau we first identified, trapping us in a cycle of self-pity and temporary retreat. But after months of intense internal work, of disciplined observation, and confronting the superficial cravings for external validation, we learned to view failure with an entirely new lens, the objective, compassionate gaze of the philosopher. We recognize that setbacks are not indictments. They are simply data points. They are required feedback mechanisms from the universe telling us where our current structure is weak, which assumption needs re-examination, or which method demands modification. The shift in perception must begin by redefining what success even means. It cannot be defined as the absence of error. If success were defined that way, we would live perpetually paralyzed by fear, afraid to try anything because the risk of failing is too great a burden to bear. To expect perfection is not merely idealistic. It is fundamentally debilitating. Therefore, our new definition must center on effort and engagement. Success becomes the commitment to showing up every single day, regardless of whether the outcome was flawless. It is the integrity of the process that holds value. The true measure of growth is not the perfect execution of a task, but the resilience displayed when the task inevitably goes wrong. This redefinition does not make failure easier. It makes it meaningful. A setback no longer prompts the panicked whisper of "I should have known better" or the self-flagellating roar of "you always mess this up." Instead, it triggers a calmer, more rigorous internal query. What specific assumption led to this outcome? Was I neglecting my disciplined observation? Did I let an old, familiar comfort, the desire for immediate ease, blind me to necessary discomfort. The greatest intellectual breakthrough here is understanding that every stumble provides precise, actionable information. A project that falls apart does not mean the endeavor was worthless. It means a specific logistical element was flawed, or perhaps our initial vision lacked critical rigor. A relationship that ends unexpectedly does not invalidate our capacity for love. It simply reveals the limits of mutual expectation or timing. This practice requires radical, non-judgmental acceptance of imperfection. We must treat our mistakes as complex companions, similar to how we addressed procrastination and self-blame earlier in our journey. Not enemies to be conquered with moralizing fervor, but flawed teachers that require deep listening and curiosity. The former me saw the mistake and collapsed into despair. The present me sees the mistake and opens up a notebook. It is simply data. I log it. I analyze it. And then I commit to a small, informed adjustment for the next attempt. This methodical approach fundamentally reclaims our internal sovereignty. We are no longer victims of circumstance or fallible impulses. We become active students of causality. The emotional consequence of this shift is profound liberation. The weight lifted from shoulders that had been constantly strained by the burden of needing to be perfect is immense. There is a palpable sense of permission to fail, and thus permission to try again immediately. This commitment to continued effort, regardless of the immediate result, becomes our anchor. It grounds us in the present moment because the only thing within our control remains this single choice: how we choose to respond right now to what has happened. We transform error from an emotional crisis into a strategic asset. Failure, therefore, is not failure at all. It is merely raw material for the next iteration of self-mastery. It is the necessary fuel that drives the continuous, permanent path toward becoming simply better than we were yesterday. This understanding solidifies our internal fortress. The knowledge that effort itself, the commitment to the discipline, is the only victory required. We arrive at a new dawn, not marked by grand epiphanies or dramatic shifts in circumstance, but by a subtle yet profound shift within the quiet architecture of the self. The journey has taught us that true mastery is not about conquering external forces, for those are vast and often indifferent to our personal struggles. Rather, it is the painstaking work of mastering the landscape of our own minds, of tending the inner garden where habits of thought take root. We have learned to observe without judgment, to pause before reacting, and to treat setbacks not as failures but as necessary data points for growth. The cumulative weight of these disciplines, the stillness found in observation, the quiet strength derived from small acts of courage, has culminated us here, at the anchor point of gratitude. The mind, by its nature, seeks patterns. It is a creature that remembers lack more vividly than abundance. When we start the day with our vision focused on what is missing, or what has gone wrong, we are essentially drawing energy from a well of perpetual complaint. This automatic habit creates an internal gravity, constantly pulling us back into scarcity. But gratitude is not merely a pleasant sentiment whispered before sleep. It is a deliberate intellectual and emotional practice. It is the act of counter-programming the mind. We must consciously intercept those early morning scripts that whisper anxieties about the day ahead or regrets about yesterday's slip-ups. Instead, we are called to seek evidence of good. Not the spectacular gifts, the promotion, the perfect relationship, the sudden windfall, but the small, enduring threads of grace woven into the ordinary fabric of existence. Think of it as training a spiritual muscle that has long atrophied from disuse. The first time we deliberately list 3 things for which we feel true appreciation, A cup of coffee on a quiet morning, the steady warmth of sunlight across a wooden floor, the simple ability to take a deep breath without pain. The effort feels clumsy, almost forced. It is like flexing an unused ligament. The initial resistance is subtle but potent. The mind recoils from giving away its natural habit of dissatisfaction. We think, I cannot list things. My life still has so much that is imperfect, and if I focus on the good, I am ignoring the overwhelming reality of struggle. But here lies the profound reversal. By forcing our attention toward what already is, the functioning mechanics of our lives, the dependable rhythms of the natural world, the steadfast presence of supportive connections, we are not minimizing or dismissing hardship. We are recognizing that within the framework of struggle, there is always an embedded foundation of support and beauty. The practice becomes a radical realignment. It shifts the source of emotional energy from what I lack to what sustains me. This shift does two vital things. First, it inoculates us against the sudden shock of negativity. When life inevitably throws its predictable barrage of minor irritations, the unexpected traffic jam, the frustrating conversation, the canceled plan, we have trained our focus elsewhere. We are grounded in appreciation for the stable things, the roof over our heads, the reliable body that carries us through the day, the quiet dignity of human connection. Second, it allows us to see interdependence more clearly. Gratitude forces us to acknowledge the invisible scaffolding upon which life is built. The community that kept us safe when we were young, the teachers who opened doors to knowledge, even the people who provided necessary friction, because friction reveals our edges. None of these elements operate in isolation. They are threads woven together by countless hands and random acts of kindness. This consistent internal inventory is not a passive meditation. It requires active participation. When we write down that we appreciate the clarity of a difficult conversation, we are not just recording data. We are acknowledging the immense courage it took to engage with vulnerability. When we thank the simple reliability of gravity, the knowledge that things fall where they should, we are embracing fundamental laws and accepting the structure of reality itself. The anchor of gratitude is thus an antidote to pervasive cynicism, which is often merely a sophisticated way of intellectualizing discontentment. Cynicism tells you nothing will ever be enough. Gratitude quietly proves it wrong by pointing out the sufficiency that already exists. It transforms our internal narrative from one of deficit, the story of what must be fixed or acquired, to one of inherent abundance, the quiet realization of the goodness that has been patiently waiting to be seen. It is a shift from demanding more from the world to accepting and savoring the gifts that are already present. This sustained practice strengthens our inner sovereignty. We learn that contentment is not an accident bestowed by fortune or success. It is a discipline, an act of focused attention. And as we carry this steady light of appreciation forward, we realize that this quiet centering becomes the permanent state of being, the continuous path where self-mastery truly resides. We have reached a point of profound clarity. The journey has been marked by encounters with ancient wisdom, through moments of painful self-inventory, and the slow discipline of choosing one's response in the space between stimulus and reaction. We learn to find our anchor not in external circumstances, but within the quiet chambers of our own judgment. Our minds have become more resilient, recognizing that suffering often springs from the gap between what we expect and what reality delivers. The previous chapters taught us about distinguishing necessity from mere desire. They showed us how a pause can create distance from automatic reaction, allowing us to choose sovereignty over habit. But there remains one final scaffolding holding back our truest freedom: the subtle, persistent tyranny of the should. Think back to those moments when you felt frustration boil up, at a colleague's failure, at a loved one's indifference, or even at your own perceived inability. Often, that heat was fueled by an invisible script, a statement beginning with the word should. I should be more organized. They should understand my struggle. One should never feel inadequate. These are not truths. They are merely polished suggestions, elegant chains forged from unexamined expectation. The should statement is perhaps the most insidious thought of all. It does not critique reality. It critiques possibility itself. It demands adherence to a rigid template of how life ought to be lived: the perfect career path, the effortless relationship, the constant state of serene success. And when life, by its magnificent unpredictability, deviates from that blueprint, we react with profound and exhausting disappointment. We learn that these should statements are fundamentally about control. They are intellectual attempts to legislate the behavior of others and the unfolding chaos of events. We build up massive edifices of expectation. My partner should anticipate my needs. Society should provide perfect support. I should always be able to predict happiness. Every time we voice a should, we are essentially drawing lines in the sand, declaring where boundaries must hold true against the tides of reality. The profound freedom offered by this understanding is that we must recognize these statements as fallacies. They are helpful guides, perhaps, suggesting ideals toward which we might strive, but they can never be immutable laws. To live under a should mandate is to live with chronic anticipation and perpetual disappointment. We are constantly setting ourselves up for the inevitable collision between our internal, ideal world and the imperfect messiness of actual existence. Consider this: life does not operate on the logic of obligation. It operates through flow, chance, choice, and entropy. When we allow ourselves to shed the mandate of should, we are granting ourselves permission to be human, to be flawed, unpredictable, sometimes disorganized, and perfectly resilient in that imperfection. The practice is one of gentle dismantling. Whenever a thought surfaces carrying the weight of expectation, I should call them, I shouldn't have said that, things should be easier, you do not argue with it. You merely observe it. You acknowledge the script without believing its premise. You hear those powerful, demanding words and respond internally with simple recognition. This is a thought based on what I assume must be true. This may not be true. This act of non-attachment to expectation is immensely liberating. It shifts our internal focus from performance to presence. Instead of asking yourself, am I meeting the standard that others should perceive? You ask, am I fully engaged in this moment? The change in scale is monumental. We move from being actors desperately trying to maintain a facade of perfection to simply being observers enjoying the rich drama of unfolding existence. This acceptance carries deep philosophical weight. It echoes the wisdom that happiness resides not at the destination we planned, but in the journey itself. The navigating, the adapting, and the small moments of grace found along the way. True self-mastery is therefore synonymous with relinquishing control over the outcome. It is the quiet realization that letting go of should means accepting the wild, messy, beautiful contingency of life. It demands a radical trust in the process, a trust that when you release the need for everything to conform to your predetermined narrative, when you accept that others might fail to understand, and that some moments will simply be difficult, you are not abandoning responsibility, but rather accepting genuine liberty. You realize that love is not dependent on perfect behavior, and growth does not require a perfect timeline. The journey from I should to perhaps I can is the final discipline. It replaces rigid expectation with open possibility. It transforms judgment into curiosity, demanding less of the self and far more in return, radical spaciousness. You find that when you stop demanding that life fit your definition of good, life finally feels free enough to simply be. This continuous practice of cognitive release solidifies the wisdom we have accumulated over these 90 days. It teaches us that true internal sovereignty is not built by erecting stronger walls around what we believe we need to control, but by tearing down those unnecessary walls entirely and stepping into the openness of possibility. We are no longer governed by the dictates of the ideal self or the perceived expectations of others. We are simply here, available, and wholly free. After confronting the internal narratives that kept us static, we arrived at a space of profound quietude. The discipline had taught us to observe our thoughts without judgment. It showed us the space between stimulus and reaction. Yet, true mastery is not merely in self-observation, nor is it found in mastering our own scripts. Sometimes, the most radical act of internal change requires an outward focus. It means turning away from ourselves, from the constant inventory of needs, from the struggle with old patterns, and dedicating our entire presence to another person. This chapter asks us to become what we have sought to be, deeply attuned listeners. The listener is perhaps the most misunderstood philosopher's tool. It is often mistaken for merely remaining silent or waiting for one's turn to speak. But listening, at its highest level, is an active act of disciplined surrender. It demands that you shed your own agenda, your need to advise, and even your desire to be understood yourself. The weight of accumulated self-knowledge can often lead to a subtle form of intellectual arrogance, the belief that because you know the philosophy, you must correct others. You find yourself formulating brilliant responses while someone else is still speaking. Your mind races with counterarguments, with solutions, with elegant summaries. This internal activity is exactly what prevents true hearing. To listen fully means choosing to keep those clever scripts entirely dormant. Consider the conversation as an empty cup. Before you can receive another person's truth, your own conversational chatter must stop flowing into it. The goal is not merely silence, it is presence. It is a non-reactive awareness that allows the speaker's words, their cadence, and their very vulnerability to wash over you unedited. You are cultivating a state of radical empathy, where understanding becomes the primary function, superseding the need for immediate reaction or diagnosis. This discipline requires immense patience. We live in a culture that rewards speed, quick judgments, and decisive answers. To truly listen feels slow, almost inefficient. It is an investment of time that yields no immediate personal reward, only the profound gift of connection to another human being. In this receptive state, you learn more about the tapestry of the human condition than you ever could by studying stoic texts or simply analyzing your own internal scripts. You begin to notice patterns in the stories people tell, patterns that mirror those within yourself, patterns that affirm certain emotional attachments and rigid expectations. You hear the desperate yearning for external validation woven into casual complaints. You hear the echoes of should statements projected onto others. They should have understood me, or people ought to live differently. But this time, you do not correct them. You simply hold space for those narratives. The power here is twofold. First, it strengthens your internal sovereignty because you realize that the emotional state and narrative of another person cannot derail your calm center. Their distress does not become your responsibility to fix. It becomes a field of pure observation. Second, By giving such deep, unbiased attention to someone else's truth, you are forced to confront the superficiality of your own constant self-talk. You see how often you speak to mask insecurity or preemptively control the emotional fallout. The practice is not always comfortable. Sometimes the person speaking is messy, tangential, or even agitated. Your practiced mind will want to categorize, summarize, and exit the conversation quickly to achieve efficiency. But the disciplined listener resists this urge. Instead, you stay anchored in the space of shared being. You allow the discomfort of ambiguity to settle over you, because within that stillness, often more truth emerges than if you had attempted a brilliant piece of advice or a perfectly structured response. The act of deep listening becomes a mirror for your own unexamined life. It forces you to acknowledge the gap between what you assume to be true and what is actually being shared with you. You realize that connection, at its deepest level, does not require fixing. Sometimes it requires merely bearing witness. To truly hear someone means accepting their reality, their flawed understanding, their current grief, or their irrational fear, as valid in the moment, without judgment, even if your accumulated philosophy suggests a better path for them. This practice of being the listener is the ultimate completion of self-mastery. It takes the disciplined internal focus and directs it outward, confirming that true emotional freedom resides not only within the quiet walls of your own mind, but also in the willingness to meet another human being with nothing but unwavering presence. You learn that the wisdom accumulated over time must eventually be deployed in service of shared humanity. By truly hearing another's story, you solidify a radical sense of sufficiency. Enough internal calm, enough patience, and enough genuine attention, no matter what external chaos unfolds around you. 90 days. 3 months have passed since the beginning of this journey. We find ourselves standing in a place that seems familiar, perhaps even uncanny. It is the same sort of quiet space we began in, yet everything around us feels subtly transformed by something unseen. The air holds a stillness that was absent before. It is not merely an absence of noise, but a profound presence of internal calm. When we look back at the self we were 90 days ago, we do not see a stranger, nor do we see a perfect being. We recognize instead the ghost of habits past, the anxious twitch toward our phones, the reflexive assumption of what others should think, the knee-jerk reaction to minor irritation. Those old scripts are still dormant within us, awaiting the slightest trigger to surface and demand performance or validation. But now, there is a noticeable gap between stimulus and response. This view from day 90 teaches us something profound about the nature of change itself. It does not arrive as a dramatic curtain lift or a sudden miracle cure. Rather, it settles in like dust motes illuminated by the morning sun, subtle, permanent, undeniable evidence of persistent inner work. We have learned that growth is not a single great act, but a relentless collection of minute choices made daily, moment after careful moment. The illusion we once lived within was one of constant reaction. We were defined by how quickly we moved from stimulus to reply. A slow car on the street, an unexpected email, a slight criticism, these acted as triggers, launching us immediately into familiar patterns of frustration or defense. We believed that freedom lay in external circumstance. If only my boss changed, then I could be peaceful. If only this relationship stabilized, then I would feel whole. That is the fundamental trap we spent months escaping. The work with ancient philosophy taught us to reclaim what was truly ours. Not the approval of others, not the outcome of a difficult project, and certainly not the predictable behavior of humanity itself. Our true dominion resides only in our ascent, the space between sensing something unpleasant and choosing how to judge it. It is here, in that invisible moment of pure choice, that sovereignty is forged. We learned that every desire we held was merely a map drawn by fear or attachment. We spent weeks cataloging these wants, that craving for perfect praise, the need to always be right, the desperation for certain stability. By observing them without judgment, gently dismissing their emotional authority, we discovered an unexpected lightness. The constant effort required to maintain expectations for others vanished. Life began to feel less like a performance review and more like simple existing. The power of the pause was not just a technique, it became a fundamental shift in identity. To breathe deliberately when anger flared, or to sit quietly before answering a challenge, transformed mere survival into disciplined mastery. It taught us that inaction, when done with awareness, is infinitely more powerful than reaction. But deep change demands honesty with our darkest corners. We could not gloss over the ingrained patterns of self-blame, the comfortable cushion of procrastination, or the tendency to assign blame externally. Chapter 6 forced us into a radical confrontation. We learned that confronting these flaws was not about beating them, but acknowledging them fully and meeting them with compassionate sobriety. They were complex parts of ourselves, worthy of observation rather than condemnation. The discipline of observation proved revolutionary in its simplicity. We ceased trying to control the stream of thought, realizing that a thought is merely electrical noise, utterly separate from the reality we claim it represents. By viewing our internal monologue as passing, whether fleeting and unimportant, we found profound mental immunity against distress. This detached awareness allowed us to become observers rather than participants in our own emotional dramas. These accumulated lessons coalesced into action through acts of courageous vulnerability. We understood that meaningful change required stepping outside the well-worn path, knowing that failure would be inevitable. But we redefined failure entirely. It was not a verdict on our character, it was simply data. Each setback, every time we spoke up when our voice trembled, every mistake we analyzed without shame, became actionable information, confirming not our weakness, but our capacity to attempt and recover. The final disciplines anchored us in permanence. Gratitude, once understood as mere polite feeling, became a structured mental discipline. It is the deliberate redirection of focus from what sustains us versus what lacks. By anchoring ourselves daily in small sources of strength, the reliable cup of coffee, the unexpected sunlight, the continuity of human connection, we built an internal surplus that could not be diminished by external lack. We systematically dismantled the tyranny of should. We released the rigid expectations we held for our lives and for everyone else. This was perhaps the deepest release, accepting radical contingency. Life does not adhere to schedules or polite scripts. It simply unfolds, beautifully messy, unpredictable, but always survivable. To accept what is meant reclaiming freedom itself. The work with others taught us that true presence required disciplined surrender. When we focused solely on listening, removing our advice, our narrative, and our agenda, we experienced a deeper level of internal sovereignty than any self-reflection could provide. Bearing witness to another's truth without needing to guide it was an act of profound freedom. And now, here we are back at the beginning point. The routine persists. People still rush past. Sirens still sound in the distance. But the inner quality has changed entirely. We carry a different kind of gravity with us, a deep, settled quietness. It is not the absence of worry, for life itself guarantees perpetual challenge. Instead, it is the knowledge that we possess an internal anchor stronger than any storm. The 90 days were not about achieving a perfect state. They were about adopting a permanent stance toward imperfection. The goal was never to arrive at day 90 and stop moving. It was simply learning how to begin again, moment after moment, with clarity, resilience, and the quiet understanding that we are always, fundamentally, in progress. The final lesson we confront is perhaps the hardest to internalize. We believed for 90 days that change was a series of milestones, a set of victories culminating in a specific moment of arrival. We anticipated standing at an end point and declaring, "I have done it." The process felt like reaching a summit, a place of profound stillness and undeniable completion. But as we stand here now, looking back over the 90-day climb, we must understand that this was never about a destination at all. The wisdom gained through deep observation, the discipline of the pause, and the radical acceptance of what lies beyond our immediate control. These were not temporary tools for survival. They are fundamental shifts in how the self relates to existence itself. To think of change as something that can be completed, like a grand project with a final checklist item, is to misunderstand the very nature of being alive. The true revolution was never an event. It was a refinement of attention. It resided in the quiet commitment made every single morning when we woke up, and demanded again and again when life challenged our newly constructed internal boundaries. The path that stretched out before us for those 90 days merely illuminated a truth that had always been available. Nothing truly changes, because everything is constantly changing already. The plateau of stagnation was not an external condition. It was a momentary lapse in our constant vigilance. We mistook comfortable predictability for genuine peace, and the pain of recognizing that habit trap forced us to look deeper into the architecture of our own minds. We learned how to separate needs from desires. We discovered the immense power contained within simply pausing before reacting, allowing the immediate emotional storm to dissipate into thoughtful consideration. We mastered the art of being fully present, not by forcing ourselves to empty our thoughts, but by acknowledging them as transient forms passing through a wider consciousness. The commitment we forged was one toward unceasing self-inquiry. It meant moving beyond mere intellectual understanding, knowing that procrastination is harmful, and into the daily, vulnerable act of correcting that faulty behavior. It demanded seeing setbacks not as evidence of personal failure, but simply as data points guiding us back to effort and resilience. This ongoing commitment required discarding the invisible chains of expectation, those insidious statements that forced life into neat, predictable little boxes. We had to accept the beautiful, untamed chaos of reality, realizing that freedom was not found in controlling outcomes, but in surrendering the right to predict them. The deep listening, an act we learned through profound vulnerability with others, showed us that true sovereignty is often exercised when we set aside our own narratives. It required us to be entirely receptive vessels for another person's truth, understanding that sometimes the deepest form of self-respect is found in pure, unbiased witnessing. These lessons, the radical acceptance from ancient philosophy, the grounding practice of gratitude, the strength derived from small acts of courage despite overwhelming fear, these are not checkpoints. They are muscles, and like any muscle, they require constant use to maintain their strength. If we stop asking ourselves how we can show up better right now, if we allow comfort to lure us back into old habits of judgment and assumption, these strengths will inevitably atrophy. The continuous path is the sustained choice to meet every morning not with a list of goals that must be achieved, but with a profound question. How can I approach this moment with more wisdom, more patience, and more presence than I did yesterday? It is the choice to remain relentlessly non-judgmental when facing an error. It is the choice to assume good intent in others while holding steady to one's own core values. It is the quiet refusal to let disappointment breed resentment or withdrawal. It is accepting that perfection is not a required state of being, but rather the journey itself, flawed and magnificent, unfolding moment by passing moment. The discipline shifts from conquering an enemy outside ourselves to befriending our inner nature, understanding its cycles of complaint, fear, assumption, and occasional brilliance. We are learning to treat our own minds with the same compassionate observation we would grant a wise friend who is going through difficulty. This understanding liberates us entirely, because the goal was never arrival. The goal was the process itself. The life lived after these 90 days requires not less effort, but a different kind of effort, one based on continuous attention and radical engagement with the present reality. It means accepting that the self is not a fixed statue, but a river, constantly flowing, always changing, and beautiful precisely, because it never rests in one single place. The true journey continues beyond any arbitrary timeline. The wisdom we now carry, the ability to pause, to listen deeply, to acknowledge our internal resistance without judgment, to anchor ourselves through gratitude even amidst difficulty, is the lifelong citizenship of a newly examined self. It is a commitment not just to living better, but to perpetually becoming. We are therefore free from the burden of defining success as a fixed state. Success, finally understood, is simply the persistent, loving act of return